Well, I just want to welcome you. My name is Jason. I'm on the teaching team here at Madison Church, and I'm so glad you're joining us online today. You know, I've known your pastor, Stephen, for a very long time, and one thing you may not realize about him, but you may, I'm not sure, is that he is an avid golfer. He is always inviting me to go golfing. He always tells me, hey, I've been working on my swing. Let's go out. I can show you how amazing I am. And sure enough, every time we go out, Stephen's there, and he takes this beautiful, slow, methodical swing, and he pipes it right down the middle of the fairway. And I'm always in awe of how he hits it so perfectly. Now, the thing, though, is that you would think that I would know how to swing that way because I've been playing golf literally 40 years longer than Stephen has, but I don't. See, here's what I do when I step up to the tee box. I channel my inner Tiger Woods, and I think that I am like Tiger Woods, and so I try to hit the ball as hard as Tiger Woods, so I swing as hard as I possibly can, and the ball always flies a very long way, 3 fairways over, in a parking lot or on somebody's deck. It's always out of bounds. It's always a bad shot. And inevitably, Stephen will say to me, here, why don't you take a mulligan? Now, for those of you who don't play golf or have any desire to ever play golf and think golf isn't really a sport, that it's just for lazy athletes like myself, let me help you understand what a mulligan is. A mulligan is a do-over. It's completely illegal in golf, but for those of us who are not professionals, we like to take mulligans. And so, sure enough, he gives me a mulligan. He says, just do it over. Start over. And so I tee the ball up. I get my inner Tiger Woods again, and I usually actually end up hitting it in the exact same spot. But I love taking the mulligan. I think John Orberg, who I owe a lot of these thoughts to, is right when he says, wouldn't it be nice if in life we got mulligans? You know, you get pulled over by a cop and he asks for your license and you say, it's okay, officer, I'm taking my mulligan right here. Or you forget to study for a test and you turn it in to your prof and you say, it's okay that I didn't get any of the answers right, I'm taking my mulligan. And while we smile at those, there are bigger areas of life where we want to start over, where we'd love to take a mulligan. Maybe you have a relationship with a kid, and maybe he or she's an adult right now, and as their parent, you never thought this relationship would be so broken. And yet it is. You want a mulligan. And maybe you're in the throes of an addiction, and you look back, and you know where it went wrong. You know where there was that tipping point, and everything turned south, and the addiction got worse and worse and worse. You want a mulligan. Or maybe you've said yes to everything and anything in life, and now you feel like you're so busy you can't even think straight. If you could go back and say no to certain things, you would. You want a mulligan. Or maybe this year, it's really the first time you've tried to reconnect with God in a long time. The last year or 2 or 5, there have been years where you've drifted, not intentionally, but you've drifted away from God. And if you could do it all over again, you would. You want a mulligan. My guess is that in some way, big or small, we all need a mulligan. You know, we've been in a series called Starting Over, and this series could really be summed up in this one question. God asking us, do you want a mulligan? Do you want to start over again? Do you want a story of redemption that you don't have right now? Well, in John chapter 21, we meet a man who took his mulligan in a big way. The Apostle Peter. You see, Peter, when we first meet him in the Bible, his name is actually Simon. He's doing the family business. He's a fisherman. But then one day, Jesus sees Simon fishing, and he sees that Simon's having no luck. And so he says to Simon, hey, throw your nets on the other side. And sure enough, Simon throws his nets on the other side of the boat. And what shouldn't happen does happen. And this huge catch of fish happens, so much so that the nets begin to break. And in that moment, Simon knows that this Jesus is different than any man he's ever met, that this Jesus is actually God. And in that moment, he falls at his feet and starts to worship Jesus. And Jesus says to him, follow me now. And Simon follows. And Jesus gives him a new name. His name is no longer Simon, it's Peter. And Peter, or literally Petros, means rock or solid one, or somebody who is the foundation of everything. And Peter's, he's one of these people that if he jumps into something, he jumps in all the way. He's loud. He's passionate. He's totally bought in. He says things before he thinks. And, he's the guy at the football stadium that comes in freezing temperatures with his chest painted and his foam figure up and the cheese head on. He's yelling at the refs the whole game because he's that into it. He's a Packer fan. He's a Wisconsinite. He's a leader. And when Jesus asks everybody else to do something and they won't, Peter will. One day, Jesus is walking on water, and all the disciples are freaked out, but Peter isn't. He gets out of the boat, and he says, I believe I can walk on water too, and he does. When Jesus asked his disciple, who do you say that I am? It was Peter who gave the answer, you are Christ, the Son of the living God. He's Petros. He's the rock. He's a passionate follower of Jesus. And yet, in the moment that Jesus needs Peter the most, Peter fails. In the moment when Jesus needs Peter to be by his side, Peter turns the other way. You know the story. Jesus has been arrested, falsely accused, dragged off to be executed. All the other disciples have bailed on Jesus, and Peter's by a fire, and 3 different people come up to him, and they ask him, aren't you with that man, Jesus? Aren't you one of his followers? And each time, Peter says, no, I'm not. I don't even know him. And now let's give Peter a bit of a break here. He partly says that because he knows if he admits to it, he probably will be killed too. And yet in that moment, when Jesus needs him the most, Peter says, I don't even know that guy. And this is what happens the 3rd time. In Luke chapter 22, after Peter denies him, it's fascinating words. It says this, the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And then it says that Peter went outside and wept bitterly. Now the story continues. You know the rest of the story. Jesus dies. He rises again from the dead. And Peter doesn't give up on his belief of Jesus. He just doesn't think Jesus wants to use him anymore. He must have thought that Jesus no longer can use him because he's damaged goods now. The best he can be is a distant follower. After all, Jesus had once said, if you deny me before men, I will deny you before my Father in heaven. And Peter had denied him. So Peter goes back to the one thing he started out doing before he met Jesus. He goes back to fishing. And we find him back in his boat. Back to the life he used to know. Back away from Jesus. He's just damaged goods. And he's staring failure in the face. He's at the place where you look at the mess you've made and you ask yourself, how could I have been so stupid? God can't use me anymore now. But what Peter doesn't realize is that in this moment, Jesus is about to give him the mulligan of a lifetime. I want to read the story to you, so just buckle up and I want you to listen in and just stick with me as I read this. John chapter 21, verse 1. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them, and they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat. But that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. And then the disciple whom Jesus loved, he's referring to John, said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, at about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it, and some bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish you have just caught. And so Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. You see, Jesus is offering Peter a mulligan, and as we see him do this, we realize that he is offering the same to us in our lives today. But if we're ever going to start over, if we're ever going to have a redemption story in our lives, there are three questions we must answer. And the first one is probably the hardest question. It's the question we have to ask when we're staring our failure dead in the face, and it's this: how did I end up here? How did I end up here? See, oftentimes when we feel like a failure, we want to just have a quick fix without really examining what has got us there in the first place. And yet David would say in the Psalms, you desire truth in the inner parts. In other words, God, in order for me to get where you want me to go, I first have to understand why I'm where I am. And so the question is, are we willing to open up the inner parts of our lives and ask the tough questions? You know, I think when Peter was in his boat back fishing, he was getting really honest with himself. I think he spent a long time examining how he fell so fast, so hard. I've often wondered what it would be like to just sit down with Peter and ask him, so Peter, how did you get to the point of denying Jesus? I think he would say several things. The first thing I think he would say, though, is, I was overconfident. I was overconfident. You know, Peter assumed that while everybody else would fail, he wouldn't. He was overconfident. Listen to what Peter said to Jesus in Matthew 26. Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. In other words, Peter's saying, Jesus, everybody else, they're kind of spiritual babies, but I'm not. I'm Petros. I'm the rock. You can always count on me. But what he forgot is that he was human. And all of us in our humanity, we fall and we stumble. And we're not actually as strong as we thought we once were. My guess is that when it comes to the area of your life where you feel like you're failing, you never thought you would be there. Other people maybe would get there, but not you. You never thought you would have that financial insecurity. You never thought that you wouldn't have a great relationship with your parents or with your kids. You never thought your marriage would end or be on the ropes like it is now. You never thought you would have that ongoing struggle. You never thought you would lose your confidence. You never thought you'd have this depression that you struggle with. Those failures were for other people, less mature people, not you. Eugene Peterson paraphrases 1 Corinthians 10 this way. He says, don't be so naive and self-confident. You're not exempt. You could fall flat on your face as easily as anyone else. For those of you who know my story, you know that I'm an recovering sex addict. I shared my story several months ago here at Madison Church. By God's grace, I am now 867 days sober, and I hope tomorrow will be 868 days sober. But I remember when I was in the throes of my addiction and while trying to lead a church at the same time, I was thinking to myself, I can beat this. I know other people need to go to recovery groups, and I know they need to admit their struggles to somebody else, but I can't do that, so I'm just going to beat this on my own. In fact, I'm spiritual enough. I'm the pastor of the frickin' largest church in Wisconsin, after all. I got this. I can do this. But I couldn't. And I didn't. And it cost me my ministry, my job, my reputation, my finances, and my marriage. Don't be so naive and self-confident. 1 Corinthians 10:12. You're not exempt. You could fall flat on your face as easily as anyone else. And I think Peter would say, that's what I did. I was overconfident. But I also think he would say, you know what? I was alone. That's why I ended up where I was just alone. You see, when Jesus was arrested, all the other disciples took off, and Peter's still following, but he's out on an island by himself. You see, when you're alone, you do things you never thought you would do. You promise not to do them, but you end up doing them because you just kind of drift. You know, in the 12-step recovery groups that I'm a part of, there is an acronym that we use. It's called HALT, H-A-L-T. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. And the thought is that anytime you're one of those or a combination of any of those, you're more than likely to struggle with things you don't want to struggle with. And I think the one we struggle with the most is when we're lonely. Because when we're lonely, we drift into behaviors and things and thoughts that we never thought we would. And it starts at an early age. I remember when my son Micah was 3 years old, he was the cutest and sweetest boy you could ever imagine. I mean, he would just come up and cuddle with you, sit on your lap, and he would laugh, he would smile, he would melt your heart. But when I would leave the room, something would switch inside his brain. The saint would become a devil. And I don't know what actually happened, but he'd become extremely mischievous. I remember one time I left the room for just a couple of minutes and went to my bedroom, and I came back, and Micah, at 3 years old, was sitting on top of the refrigerator. And another time I left to go out to the garage, and I came back, and Micah had 2 huge knives, and he was just going like this with them, pretending to attack somebody. Another time I left, and he was drinking some cleaner from underneath the sink, and all the time he would do this, he would usually be naked. He would just shed his clothes. I was so proud. But here's my point, and I actually do have one. When left alone, even at an early age, we tend to drift from what we know is right. So it's when we're alone on a business trip, or alone awake with our worries, or at our desk in anger, that we give free rein to thoughts and actions that we normally wouldn't. And we don't have to be physically alone for this to happen. We just need to feel like we're all alone. And when we feel like we're alone and nobody's watching, or even worse, that nobody cares, our worst version of ourselves comes out. If not in action, at least in our thoughts. We kill people in our minds. We worry, we gossip, we go into habits and things that we promised we wouldn't have. We drink too much, we eat too much, we spend too much, we numb out too much on Facebook and Netflix. We get our fix. And sometimes we stay medicated on those things for years. But that fix never really delivers what it promises, and we end up where Peter did, in a place of failure. So I think he would say I was alone, I was overconfident. But the final thing I think he would just say is, you know what? The reason I ended up where I'm at, I was just confused. You see, I found that oftentimes in life, when life doesn't make sense, when you're in a job transition, when you're contemplating change, or when you're in the middle of a pandemic that has robbed all sense of normalcy in your life, that you are most likely to stumble. And I think it was the same for Peter. He was confused. The person he had given everything to in his life, Jesus, was now taken from him. And it was easy for him to just drift in that moment, to do things he never thought he would do. So let me ask you, in the area of your life where you're facing failure, have you asked yourself, how did I get here? How did I end up here? Maybe it's one of those reasons. Maybe it's something else. Whatever it is, until you figure out where you are at, you'll never be able to go to where God wants you to go. You'll never be able to take that mulligan. So the first question you need to ask yourself is, how did I end up here? But the second, if you want to find a redemption story in your life, the second question you need to ask is this: do I know how Jesus feels about me? Do I know how Jesus feels about me? See, the story goes like this. Peter and the disciples haven't caught anything while fishing, when all of a sudden they hear a familiar voice from the shore saying, "Throw your nets on the other side." Now, immediately, this triggers Peter's memories back to the first time he met Jesus, where Jesus said, "Throw your nets on the other side of the boat." And all of a sudden, fish, like it did before, start coming out of nowhere. Peter remembers who Jesus really is, how he feels about him. And when he finds out that it is Jesus on the shore, he jumps out. Remember, Peter's kind of crazy. He just jumps out of the boat and starts swimming as fast as he can to see Jesus. Why he doesn't just row with the rest of the disciples, I have no idea. But he swims the length of a football field to get there. But he doesn't care. He just wants to be with Jesus. And I find that fascinating, because if I were Peter, I would stay in the boat, maybe set sail again, go far away from Jesus at all costs. But Peter doesn't. And the reason he doesn't is because he knows that facing Jesus is a whole lot easier than facing the demons of shame and failure and regret. Now, I wonder how many nights before that Peter had replayed the scene over and over again in his head of denying Jesus. I wonder if any time he heard a rooster crow, if it sent shivers down his spine. If he would just do anything he could to get away from that life of guilt. And yet, instead of running away from Jesus, Peter swam to Jesus. And the reason he did that, I think, is that he realized that the pain of staying in the boat was far greater than the pain of facing the consequences of his failure. See, that happens in our life, that we have to come to a point of realizing that the pain of staying where we're at is far greater than the pain of dealing with our stuff. And so Peter just jumps out of the boat, swims to the shore. And then what happens next is very fascinating. Verse 9 says this: when they landed, they saw a fire with burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Now that may seem insignificant to you, but it is a huge, huge verse. Because the only other time in the New Testament where we hear of a fire of burning coals is when Peter denied Jesus. When he stood at the fire and Jesus looked straight at him after he denied him for the third time. And if I'm Peter, I'm thinking to myself, okay, Jesus is building the fire to remind me of my greatest failure in life. That's why he built it here, to remind me of the time that I denied him, where I was supposed to be there, but I wasn't. I'm going to have to turn in my discipleship badge. I'm going to have to just give up. He's going to give me the pink slip. But he doesn't. Look at what Jesus does next. Verse 12, Jesus said to them, and I love this, "Come and have breakfast." Jesus doesn't say, "Get back in your boat." Jesus doesn't say, "Oh, Peter, how could you?" Jesus just says, "Do you like syrup on your pancakes? Can you pass the OJ?" See, when Peter was expecting rebuke and disappointment, he found the presence of God. He found intimacy, and he found love and forgiveness and grace. And what Jesus offered Peter is what he offers us. When we think he doesn't want anything to do with us, he just says, "Would you just have some breakfast with me?" And so Micah, who was a crazy child at age 3, would often get into trouble. And like I said, he was energetic, and he would do things that where his brain went out of control. And I remember one day he was playing with one of my belts, and he thought in his mischievous way that it was a good idea to just swing it around his head as fast as he could. And I remember talking to him, I said, "Micah, if you don't stop swinging that around, you're going to break something, or even worse, hurt somebody. And you, Micah, my child, will get in trouble." And so being the obedient child that he was, he swung it even more and even harder. And I wasn't paying attention. I knew he was still swinging it, but I had to go get something. I came back, and he was still swinging it. And all of a sudden, the belt buckle whacked me in the head. And in that moment, I didn't have my greatest parenting moment. I kind of mumbled on my breath, "Micah, I told you not to do that. This is what happens when you are a devil. This is how you hurt people." And I'll never forget my little boy ran to his room downstairs. I heard the door slam and lock. I was still upstairs nursing my wound, not paying attention to what was going on. And then several minutes later, I went down to his room. The door was locked, and so I did what any good parent would do. I picked the lock, and I opened the door, and I saw my little boy curled up in the corner of his room in his bed with his head down and his hands like this, and he had been sobbing for several minutes, and it was just that deep breath, the short breaths that little boys take when they've been crying for a long time. And I watched him there, and to my embarrassment, I stood there a little bit longer than I should have because it was so cute. And I wondered what was going through his mind. I wondered if he thought he had just committed the unpardonable sin. I wonder if he was thinking about the other families who maybe could adopt him, the boy who hurts people with belt buckles. I wonder if he thought this was the end of the road for him. And so I walked over to the edge of the bed. He still didn't move. I then grabbed him and put him in my lap. I just started stroking his hair. And I took my hands and put his face in them, and I said, "Micah, look at me." And I said, "Do you know what you did?" And he said, "Yes, Dad. I swung the belt and I hurt you and I shouldn't have, and I'm so sorry." I said, "Okay. Now, Micah, do you know how much I love you?" He said, "I think so." I said, "Micah, do I love you this much?" He said, "No, Dad." I said, "Micah, do I love you this much?" "No, Dad." "Micah, how much do I love you?" "Dad, you love me this much." And I said, "Yeah, Micah, no matter what you do, I will always love you this much." This is the story of Christianity. That no matter how much we think we are not deserving of God's love, that Jesus on the cross said, "I love you this much." See, here's the deal. There are actually no free mulligans in life. Life is not a game. A score is taken, and it's a matter of life and death. And there had to be a cost in order for us to get a mulligan. For the wages of sin, Paul would write, is death. But the gift of God, the mulligan, is eternal life through Christ Jesus our Lord. So Jesus went to the cross. He said, I'll take your failures on me. I'll become the worst moments of your life. I'll become your ugly so you can become my beautiful. And at the cross, with his arms stretched out, the perfect Son of God was saying to us, I love you this much. You are not your divorce. You are not your dismissal or your demotion. You are not your addiction. You are not what your kids said of you. You are not the poor student. You are not the second string. You are not the bad child. You are not who they say you are. You are not too young, too old, too rich, too poor. You are not washed up or used up. You are not just a dollar figure. You are not just a title. No, you are somebody that I died for because I love you this much. And so here's your mulligan. So the question is, will you take it? And if you're going to take it, there is one more question Jesus needs you to answer. And it's this: do you still love Jesus? You and I have to answer this question: do I still love Jesus? See, Jesus isn't done with Peter. He still needs to talk to him. So they go for a walk, and Jesus has a question for Peter. And I wonder if Peter's thinking, okay, the breakfast thing was a charade. Now he's going to really lay into me. Now he's going to tell me. Now that he has me all alone, he's going to tell me what he really thinks. But look at what Jesus does instead. Verse 15, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. As Jesus asked him 3 times, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? He is again bringing Peter back to that moment of 3 denials. And I think he's saying it 3 times because he wants Peter to know that Peter doesn't have to live in the past, that he still has a future. There still is a redemption story. But the future is predicated on how Peter answers this one question. And it's a very vulnerable question for Jesus to ask. Jesus is putting it out there and saying, Peter, I'm not going to force you to love me. I'm offering you this mulligan, but you have to choose. Because love, true love, is about choice. Peter, I'm not going to presume you want the intimate relationship with me that you once had. I'm not here to force that on you. I'm not here to guilt trip you into this. You can stay here and fish if you want to. I'll still love you, but you have to choose to love me if you want this redemption story, if you want to start over. And so Jesus, in a moment of vulnerability, is just asking, will you love me? Peter, will you take this? And 3 times Peter says, yes. 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 And then in verse 19, Jesus says, all right, then let's go, follow me. And Peter follows, and as you watch Peter's life, you see Peter leading the church. You see Peter who is so powerful that when his shadow passes over somebody, they are healed. You see Peter who has confidence again, who is living a new story. He takes the mulligan. And Jesus is asking you today, do you still love me? He's not going to force it on you. But if you want a new chapter in your story, if you want to take the mulligan, you have to say yes. And so the question is, will you take your mulligan?